Well, there was a church that had an elder in this church, and he had been a part of this church for a long time. He'd actually been an elder for a long time. In fact, so much so that people thought of him when they thought of the church. So he was a fixture there in that church. Well, as time went on, they had a new elder come on. And they brought this guy, and he became an elder. And the longtime guy expected that the rookie would just kind of quietly listen and go along with whatever he said. But as they started to meet and talk and discuss things, this new elder started making some suggestions. He had some new ideas. And others in the group, other elders and other people in the church, they liked some of his ideas. And they started implementing some of those things. And people started to voice their appreciation for this new elder. Now, this was all a good thing. The church started to make a few changes, and they actually started reaching a few new people. But the longtime elder didn't like it because he felt like he was losing control. And he became jealous. And his jealousy turned into a power struggle. And he eventually started rumors about this new elder. And he started collecting people to his side of things, and eventually split the church. Now, that's really just an amalgamation of lots of stories I've heard. It's happened more than once. You hear about these kinds of things and how it plays out like this. You see, jealousy is an ugly thing. And this jealousy can show up in so many different situations. And it can be expressed in so many different ways. And jealousy being a sin in itself, but jealousy may then lead to other sins as well. Jealousy is not befitting the people of God. We are followers of Jesus. And what do we know about Jesus? In fact, we just talked about it as we took communion. What did he do? He sacrificed himself. Jesus is a giving, self-sacrificing person, not a selfish person. And so we, as the followers of Jesus, should be the same. Well, today, as we look into 1 Samuel, we are going to see how God protected David and how he caused David to be successful and to gain the respect of all the people. But we are also going to see how jealousy turned Saul against David and led to resentment and fear, led to dishonesty and conspiracy, led to deceit and exploitation, led to hatred and even attempted murder. Saul is on a downward spiral, and it starts with a little jealousy. So let's begin in chapter 18, verses 1 through 5. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And so we're picking up the story here right where we left it off last week, right after the battle with the Philistines, where David had faced and killed Goliath. And so right after that, Saul and David have this conversation, and we learn here that Saul has taken David into his service full time. And he will now send him out to fight his battles for him. And wherever, we give this little summary, wherever David went, he was successful. Whatever he did, he was successful every time. And so Saul, because of David's success, Saul made him a commander in his army. And David was advancing through the ranks. And everyone was happy about it. Everyone was good with it. They approved of it. Why? Because David was successful with everything he did. But then we're also told in these verses that after Saul and David had their first conversation after the battle, that Jonathan and David formed a friendship. And Jonathan, we were told, was knit to David. His soul was knit to David's soul, and meaning that they were connected. They were inseparable. So they're like best friends. You can't come between them. But we're also told that Jonathan loved David and that Jonathan made a covenant with David, or a promise, basically, a covenant agreement, like a contract. He made a covenant to David. Now, this is saying more than just they're best friends. This is speaking about loyalty that is unbreakable. So Jonathan was loyal to David, and his loyalty was unbreakable. See, Jonathan was apparently very impressed with David. But that's understandable, because what do we know about Jonathan? What did we read here a few weeks ago? Jonathan was a person who was devoted to God and who trusted God. He was a man of faith. And if you remember, he had gone into battle and he had done courageous things, believing that God was in control. Remember, he said, let's climb that hill, and if God will give them into our hands, then they'll say, come here. And that's what happened. But he's just going up saying, trusting, well, God's going to take care of us. Whatever God does is good. And so he was a person who believed that God was in control, and he would go into battle and do courageous things. Now, what did David just do? The same thing. He said, I'll go fight Goliath when nobody else would. I'll go fight Goliath. God will take care of me. And so they're similar in this thing. They're both godly men of faith. Also, though, Jonathan, we saw, was a good leader, and we said he would have made a good king. David is also a good leader, as we see here, and he's raising up through the ranks. He's also a good leader, and we know that he will be king, because God has chosen him to be king. But this makes sense that they would become close friends, because they value the same things and they see life the same way. They are godly men of faith. So they form this deep friendship, and Jonathan is completely committed to David. We're told here that he even gave him his robe, the robe he was wearing, and he gave him his armor and his weapons. Now, this is significant. This isn't just a friend saying, here, have some stuff. This is significant because Jonathan, if you remember, Jonathan was in line to be king after his father. At least if things had progressed how they normally would have, he would have become king. Most people in Israel are probably expecting that Jonathan will be king. Jonathan is in line to be king. On the other hand, Jonathan knew about Samuel's prophecy to Saul, that he would not have a dynasty, and that he would be replaced. Saul would be replaced as king by another, quote, who is better than you. In other words, someone who would be obedient to God and someone who was faithful to God. And Jonathan appears here to be insightful. And though he doesn't know that David has already been anointed to become king, he figures that David is the one to replace Saul, the one who is better than his father. Because, get this, that robe that Jonathan was wearing, that he took off and gave to David, that robe that Jonathan wore would have been his royal robe. And what did he do with it? He gave it to David. And he made a covenant committing himself to David. In other words, he was committing to be loyal to David. And I read these and I think this suggests that Jonathan assumes David is the one who will be king. And Jonathan, as a person of faith, is okay with that. He's good with it. Whatever God's going to do, I'm good with it. So he's good with God's plan, whatever that means. Even though that means loss for him personally. I could have been king. But God's going to bring someone else to be king. Okay, I'm good with God's plan. Are we willing to do the same? Are we willing to be obedient, to go along with God's plan, even if it means it might cost us something? Well, the reason we're told here about Jonathan is because he stands in contrast to Saul. See, when we see Jonathan, we see also just how messed up Saul has become. How messed up his thinking is. So they're in contrast to each other. Jonathan is loyal to David, but Saul turns against David. And in the next verses, we're going to see several different incidents that show us how this is happening and what Saul is doing and how twisted his thinking has become. So let's keep reading in verse 6. It says, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. So after the victory, over the Philistines, when David had killed Goliath, the army goes home. And as they come home, they are greeted with this celebration, and the women are singing about the victory. And this song has these two lines in it that are parallel statements. The first one is praise for Saul. And the second one then is praise for David. But David receives the greater praise. Now, if you think about it, that's actually fitting to the situation. Because what just happened? Saul and the rest of the army had sat for 40 days and hid from Goliath and his challenge. David came along, and when he showed up, he said, who is this guy to mock the armies of the living God? And he immediately went and said, I'll take care of it, and killed Goliath. So this actually is fitting to the situation. But when the women were singing this song, they weren't putting Saul down. They were actually still praising Saul. I mean, Saul had killed his thousands. Actually, for both David and Saul, they're using exaggerated numbers. They're saying, look how great these guys are. So they're actually praising Saul. They're not putting him down. They're both being praised, but Saul only focuses on the fact that they give David better praise, higher praise. And he's jealous, and he's angry. And not only that, now he's suspicious of David. We're told that he eyed David from that day forward. In other words, he kept his eye on him. He was like, he's going to try and take the kingdom from me. He's suspicious of David. He doesn't trust him. Maybe he's putting these things together. David may be the one who Samuel talked about. And he's in a position to take the kingdom. But the problem is Saul doesn't want to give it up. Saul wants to keep that kingdom for himself. He wants to keep that power and that praise for himself. And so he doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him what God has said. He just wants to keep everything for himself because he's jealous. Back in chapter 16, when David first came and started playing his harp for Saul, we were told that Saul loved David, that Saul greatly loved David. So he appreciated David, he was loyal to David, But now he's jealous of David, and that has bred distrust in David and suspicion about David. And this is only the beginning. It will continue. Because Saul's first priority is holding on to the throne that God is giving to another. He is actively opposing the will of God. And he's refusing to follow God's plan because he's selfish. It's all about him and what he can have for himself and what he can keep for himself, even at the cost of opposing God. You see, he's the exact opposite of Jonathan. Jonathan says, okay, whatever God does, I'm good with, even if it costs me. Saul says, I want what I want, even if it means I'm not on the same page with God. Look at verse 10, the next. And the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed on Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre. And he did as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. So that troublemaking spirit is back again. And we're told here that the Spirit rushed upon Saul. Now, these are the same words that were used when the Holy Spirit, after Saul was anointed, when the Holy Spirit rushed upon Saul, came upon Saul with power. And so in using these words, he's emphasizing the intensity of the situation, that this Spirit is rushing upon him. It's coming, and it's making an impact. And it shows us just how tragic Saul's story has become. You see, he rejected God and has now been rejected by God. And the Holy Spirit no longer is helping him, but another spirit has come and is tormenting him. And we're told here that Saul raved or prophesied. Some versions, English versions, have the word prophesied. The word there is the word that's usually translated as prophesied. But it can refer to like prophecy, like actual words, or it can refer to like music. Like remember when Saul had been anointed and he was sent home, and Samuel told him, on your way home you're going to meet some prophets and you're going to prophesy? And it happened. He met these people who were coming down and they were singing and playing instruments, and Saul joined in with them. And so it doesn't always mean specifically just that he's speaking the words of God. It has to do with just that they're experiencing a supernatural ability from God. And so here, it's not that Saul is giving them a message from God, but it's some kind of ecstatic experience that he's having that's caused by that spirit that is bothering him, that is tormenting him. And it shows them that he's being afflicted. It's how they know that he's being afflicted by that spirit. But while that's happening, Saul decides, I have a spear in my hand, I'm going to throw it at David. I'll kill him. I'll stick him to the wall. Now, the servants, Saul's servants, and by the way, that happened twice. So it wasn't just one time, but twice it happened. But Saul's servants and possibly David may have just written that off as, well, he's in one of those moods, or, well, he's being afflicted by that spirit, and just kind of excused it as it just happened because of his state of mind. But I think that may just be a cover that Saul is using. It's in that time where he decides, I can kill him and get away with it. Because we know about Saul's jealousy. We know about his suspicion of David. We know that he wants to get rid of David. And so he tries twice and fails. Well, look what happens next. Verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them. So Saul is not only jealous, not only suspicious, but now he's afraid of David. But David has not done anything to cause him to be afraid. David has been nothing but loyal to Saul and has served him faithfully. But Saul is afraid of him. David's given him no reason to fear him, but we're told why he's afraid of him. Why is it? It's because Saul knows that God is helping David and he's not helping Saul. He knows that God is on his side. And he sees this because David is successful no matter what. No matter what he does, no matter where he goes, he's always successful. So Saul looks at this situation. He knows that David is better equipped to be king than he is. You see, David is more than just a great warrior. I mean, he sees that, but also everyone loves him. So everyone's willing to would follow him. And because of all this, Saul sees David as a threat. And he knows his day is coming. Well, look what happens next, verse 17. Then Saul said to David, "Here's my elder daughter Merab. I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me." In other words, fight for me. Strong, bravely, courageously. Be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. For Saul thought, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. And David said to Saul, "Who am I and who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king?" But at that time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Meholathite for a wife. Now remember the reward that the soldiers were talking about when Goliath was challenging the people of Israel, the army of Israel, and the soldiers started talking about a reward for the man who would stand up and kill Goliath. Part of that reward was what? That Saul would give the man his daughter in marriage for a wife. Well, here at this point, that's being offered to David. But Saul has another motivation. See, he decides to be sneaky here. He has another motivation because if David is the son-in-law of the king, he figures that's going to make him a bigger target to the Philistines. They will want to kill him even more. And maybe David will get killed in battle because they'll be after him. And so Saul wants this to happen. Now, the ironic thing is that here we have the king of Israel actually hoping for a loss in battle so that David would be dead. So he's hoping that this will happen. So Saul here, what we see here is that Saul is, as a father, this is hard to understand. But Saul here is perfectly happy to use his daughter to get rid of his enemy. I mean, here, marry my daughter so they might kill you. See, if Saul has them kill him in battle, then there's no evidence that Saul wanted to do it or did it. He says, then I don't have to get my hands dirty. I'll just let them do it for me. And he's perfectly happy to let his daughter be mixed up in the middle of this and to use her to try and get rid of David. Now, David respectfully declines. Now, it's not clear exactly why. He just says, well, who am I and who's my family? You know, kind of like we're not worthy of this. But he declines. Now, it's possible that at this point he doesn't trust Saul. I mean, after all, he has tried to throw a spear at him twice. It's possible. But it also could be that he just really doesn't feel worthy. I mean, I'm just come from an insignificant family. Or it could be possible that he just doesn't have the financial means in order to support the daughter of a king. Or the financial means in order to pay a bride price or a dowry for the daughter of a king. I mean, a royal bride price. I lean towards that third thing because of what's going to happen later. But we'll get to that when we get to that. But we don't know exactly why. But he declines respectfully. But for whatever the reason he declined, Saul doesn't press the issue, and Saul gives his daughter to someone else as a wife. But then another opportunity arises. Look at verse 20. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David as a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. And Saul commanded his servants, speak to David in private and say, behold, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now then become the king's son-in-law. And Saul's servants spoke these words in the ears of David. And David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? And the servants of Saul told him, thus and so did David speak. Then Saul said, thus shall you say to David, the king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. Now Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. And when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to be the king's son-in-law. Before the time had expired, David arose and went, along with his men, and killed 200 of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, which were given in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And Saul gave him his daughter Michal for a wife. And so Saul finds out that his other daughter loves David. And he's like, great, now I can use her. Different daughter, same story, same plan, same idea. Let's make David a bigger target and get him killed in battle, and then the problem will be solved. Not only that, but then if David's killed, then he doesn't really have to give his daughter to him either. But again, he's willing to use his daughter in this way. So he sends his servants to make this offer to David and to butter him up. To say things like, the king really likes you. Everyone likes you. You should do this. Well, David still resists. And again, the problem seems to be a little bit more clear here. He says that he's poor and not from an important family. He says, but he's poor. And so I think here what the problem is, he doesn't have the money to pay a royal bride price, a dowry, which in that culture you paid a dowry before you married, adopt someone's daughter. And he didn't have the money for it. But then Saul foresees this possibility and has another way that David can pay. He simply says, all David has to do is kill 100 Philistines and bring back proof. On the other hand, Saul is hoping that David will get himself killed, and then it's all over. He doesn't have to worry about it. So David's going to go out and try to kill 100 Philistines and try to gather up that bride price and get himself killed in the process. Well, when David hears this option, he jumps at it. He's like, okay. That's another reason why I think that is the issue. Because as soon as he hears he can do this, then he's like, okay, I'll do it. And so he accepts the offer, and his thinking is probably, well, I can just continue my service to the king and go out into the battle against the Philistines, and in the process, I can collect the bride price. I can do that. So he does. He goes into battle, and what's he do? He kills twice as many people as what Saul had required. He says, David's going to go above and beyond here. He kills twice as many people as Saul requires. So not only did he not get killed, not only was he kept safe, but he was able to double what was asked for. David is totally successful and completely safe. He comes back and he marries Saul's daughter. And at this point we see that all of Saul's deceitful scheming and his willingness to use his daughters is backfiring on him. And look how it ends, verse 28. But when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. And so it's become obvious to Saul that God is with David, that God is helping David, because everything works out for him. Everything goes his way. He says, obviously, God is helping this guy. In fact, he's more successful than anyone else. And everyone respects him. And because of all this, Saul becomes more afraid of David. And then this fear turns to hatred. And he considers David an enemy. And so even though David has faithfully served Saul and continues to faithfully serve Saul, Saul is now constantly against him. He sees him as an enemy. Now, there were several short little vignettes in the verses that we read today. Very little, a bunch of little pieces, parts. But there's a couple things that run throughout this chapter. And things about God and about his people and about success and about jealousy. You see, the word success is used 4 times in this chapter, and it's always about David. David was successful at all that he did. The Lord made him successful. David is successful. He was very successful. Why? Well, because the Lord was with David. In fact, that's said 3 times in this chapter. The reason he's successful is because God is with him. God is helping him. It's made very clear that it's not just that David is really good. He's not just a great warrior or something, but God is helping him. God is making him successful. And then we're told that Jonathan loved David, that Michal loved David, and all the people loved and respected David, but not Saul. So everyone else is loving David, respecting David, but not Saul. Why? Because he's jealous of David. So we look at these things. What does that tell us about God and his people? Well, I'm going to make a statement. God gives success to his people. Now I'm going to ask a question about that statement. What do I mean by it? God gives success to his people. But what do I mean by that? Because you know what? I have known some Christians who have really struggled with things through their lives. I know some people who you would not call successes as far as the eyes of the world are concerned. I know some people, Christians, who have even failed at stuff. So what do I mean when I say that God gives success to his people? Well, I'll explain. So God may or may not give you success in your worldly endeavors. I've also known some Christians who were great evangelists and had great success sharing the gospel. I know Christians who were great teachers. I know Christians who have used their spiritual gifts and been used by God to do great things, but who are also very poor, who are also not successful in business or those things that our world looks at and calls success. And so God may or may not give you success in your worldly endeavors, but he can give you success in what you do for him and in what is in his plan. Also, God may not always keep you safe. You know, there are some people who were following God and being obedient to God who have been killed, martyred. In fact, killed because of their faith in God. Killed because they were being obedient to God and because they would not recant or turn away from Him. So God may or may not keep you safe. Now, as we look at this story of David, we say here he did. He kept David safe. But of course that makes sense because it fits with God's plan for David's life. Because David, what do we know? He would be king. And in order to be king, he has to be alive. Right? And he has to be a respected leader. People willing and ready to follow him. God is actually preparing him to be king. That's His plan for his life. And so in all that, I said, God gives success to His people, but what success looks like will vary from person to person. But we know that God is with us. And we know that if we are faithfully following God, that He will help us. I think of this. When Jesus commissioned His disciples, what did He say? He said, go out and make disciples. Go into all the world and make disciples. And the very last thing, what did He say? And behold, I am with you always. So go, do what I have commissioned you to do. Go, do what I have called you to do. And I am with you. I'm going to help you. I will make you successful. Be obedient. And He will be with us. And He will strengthen us. And He will give us the ability to do what He has called us to do. You see, the person of faith always obeys. Well, I shouldn't say always. We all fell. But the person of faith obeys God and serves God, knowing that he is working within God's plan. That he's doing what God has called him to do. And that God will do whatever is best. On the other hand, the person who turns away from God and turns away from God's plans and seeks after his own praise and seeks after whatever he thinks is best is susceptible to jealousy. Because he's thinking about his own praise. He's thinking about his own glory rather than God's. And he's thinking about his own praise and his own glory, and he can't handle it when someone else succeeds. And jealousy can lead to twisted thinking. It can lead to fear. It can lead to suspicion and even hatred. So why would you go against God? I mean, if you know his ways and you know his plans, it doesn't make sense to fight against him. It only makes sense to join him, to follow him. And so that means don't seek for your own glory and let jealousy take hold of your heart. Don't seek for your own glory and let jealousy take over your heart. And so if God uses someone else, in his work, God uses someone else and makes them successful, then be glad about that and praise God. We can say that about churches in our area or around the world too. If God uses a church and he makes them successful, we shouldn't complain about that. I mean, Bible-believing, Bible-teaching, gospel-preaching churches, if they are successful, we should be happy about that. And we should praise God. You see, we're God's people. And God is with us. And when we, as his people, are successful, it's not about us. It's about him. It's for his glory. It's for his praise. And so whether I'm successful, or you're successful, or she's successful, or he's successful. God is glorified. God is glorified. And that is our goal. Let's glorify our God together.